Hello, this is the second part of the 5.12 video for transition. Let's finish up our reading. Okay, the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, a new crisis broke out in Iran, a vital ally to the United States in the Persian Gulf region and an important source of oil. The U.S. had long backed Iran's ruler, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, but the Shah had used much of the nation's oil resources for personal gain and aroused anger with his repressive policies. In January 1979, angry Islamic fundamentalists deposed the Shah to receive medical treatment in the United States. I missed a line there. In January 1979, angry Islamic fundamentalists deposed the Shah and forced him to leave Iran. In November, after the Carter administration allowed the deposed Shah to receive medical treatment in the United States, some 3,000 radical Islamic students retaliated by taking over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and imposing more than 60 American hostages. At first, Carter won praise for warning the Soviets not to back the new Iranian regime and for threatening military action against any attempt to cut off oil shipments in the Persian Gulf. But there seemed to be no way to strike against the Iranians without endangering the hostages. An effort by U.S. commandos to rescue them fell apart in the Iranian desert, resulting in the deaths of 8 American soldiers. The crisis dragged on for month after month, eroding public confidence in Carter and building up the Republican hopes of winning back the White House. The stage was set for the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. The Iran hostage crisis. Why? In 1979, how did the United States, one of the world's only superpowers, find itself powerless, frustrated, and humiliated with the lives of 63 countrymen at the mercy of extremists in a faraway land? The tangled roots of the Iran hostage crisis go very far back. In the wake of World War I, a nationalist leader named Reza Khan modernized and westernized Iran. He became the Shah, or king, and as Reza Shah Pahlavi, he ruled with an iron hand. Early in World War II, Allied troops occupied Iran and forced the Shah to give up his throne because they feared he would cooperate with Nazi Germany. The Allies agreed to let his oldest son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, become the new Shah with the understanding that he would rule in cooperation with the Prime Minister and elected parliament. The son thus became Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. After World War II, the new Shah supported Western governments and businesses, including Western oil companies. But he was opposed by a fervent Iranian nationalist in his government, especially the Prime Minister Mohammad 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 managed to seize the holdings of British Petroleum Company in Iran, claiming they should belong solely to Iran. By challenging the British in their profitable monopoly, Mohammad became the most admired political figure in modern Iranian history. As Mossadegh's power grew, he forced Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi to flee the country. At this point, urged on by the British, the United States stepped in. Because Mossadegh had the support of the Iranian Communist Party, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, convinced President Eisenhower and advisors of the threat of an imminent Soviet takeover of Iran. CIA operatives then engineered a military coup to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah to power. And here's a picture of the Shah of Iran and his family, surrounded by the trappings of extreme wealth. With the United States backing him, the Shah once again opened Iran's oil resources to Western businesses. Oil funded the Shah's efforts to modernize and westernize Iran. He built factories, roads, and railways. He extended the telephone system and improved rural health care and education. In the capital city, Tehran, the new cinemas, nightclubs, casinos, and bars line the streets. Under the Shah's rule, many Iranians continued to live in poverty, as wealth from oil remained in the hands of a few. The gap between rich and poor widened. Many Iranians resented the Shah's luxurious ways, though few dared say so in public because the Shah's police brutality suppressed those who opposed his rule. The Shah faced stronger opposition from Muslim clerics called Ayatollahs, religious leaders learned in Islamic law and other subjects. These Ayatollahs objected to all Western influences. They opposed many of the Shah's reforms, such as an increased women's rights and equality of citizens regardless of religion. Such practices, the Ayatollah says, went against Islamic teaching. The Ayatollahs also resented other actions by the Shah that diminished the political power of the Muslim clerics. This religious opposition to the Shah found a leader in Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini was eager to see Iran become an Islamic republic. In 1963, he spoke out against the Shah's secular reforms. The Shah responded by sending government troops to attack the Ayatollah's school. Several students were killed, and the Ayatollah himself was captured and banished from Iran. In exile, Khomeini moved first to Turkey, then to Iraq, where he lived for years, and eventually to Paris. And here's a picture of him here in the center. He kept touch with his followers by telephone and used cassette tapes to distribute his speeches back in his homeland. In these speeches, he called for an Islamic revolution and the overthrow of the Shah. Partly because of the Shah's repressive and corrupt rule, Khomeini's words found many willing listeners in Iran. The Ayatollah's message became increasingly simple: down with the Shah and death to America. In the fall of 1973, Khomeini's supporters triggered massive riots and demonstrations in Iran, which forced the all-powerful Shah to flee his nation. In February 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, now nearly 80 years old, boarded a plane and flew from Paris to Tehran. He claimed the formation of Islamic Republic and announced the beginning of jihad, by which he meant a holy war against the West. It also happened that the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the secular U.S.-backed government of Iran was overthrown and replaced by a militant Islamist regime. Upon assuming power, Khomeini's government began a crackdown that rivaled, if not surpassed, the Shah's repressive regime. Islamic revolutionary forces, including Khomeini's religious militia, the Revolutionary Guards, took action against any perceived resistance to the revolution. They imprisoned and executed thousands who did not support them. They killed many Jews, Christians, and others whose religion they found offensive, including Muslims whose faith they deemed impure or unacceptable. Khomeini and his followers also moved to suppress Western cultural influences that the Shah had favored. Americans held hostage. When the Shah was still in power, President Jimmy Carter had criticized him for his human rights abuses in Iran. Even though the Ayatollah Khomeini was proving no better, the U.S. government hoped to improve relations with the new Iranian regime. In the fall of 1979, the Iranian Prime Minister met with a top U.S. official. When a photograph of the two men shaking hands reached Iran, militant Islamists were furious. They were determined to make sure that Iran did not grow close to the United States. In November 1979, a group of Iranian students broke into the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took more than 60 Americans hostage. They announced that the hostages would be released only when the U.S. government sent the exiled Shah, who had traveled to the United States for medical treatment, back to Iran to stand trial. The students' real goals, however, were to destroy any chances of improved relations between Iran and the United States and to push any moderates of the new Iranian government. In both, they succeeded. The students soon released some of the women and African American hostages and later released one who fell ill. The Iranian government announced that the remaining hostages would be treated as spies. The United States government responded by stopping oil imports from Iran and freezing Iranian assets in the United States. The Shah left the United States to live in exile in Panama. The Iranian students, urged by the Ayatollah Khomeini, continued to hold the hostages. Khomeini gave speeches denouncing the United States as the Great Satan. Crowds gathered outside the embassy in Tehran and shouted, "Death to America!" Day after day, Americans watched the news on television, hoping to hear the hostages had been released or rescued. Instead, their frustration mounted as news reports could do little more than tally the number of days the hostages had spent in captivity. Today is 120 of the Iran hostage crisis, day 121, day 122. 5.5 months into the crisis, and unable to secure the release of the hostages through negotiation, President Carter ordered a secret high-risk rescue mission. The plan was for 90 members of the elite military unit, Delta Force, to fly into Tehran in 8 helicopters, storm the embassy, and bring the hostages out. From the start, everything went wrong. 3 of the helicopters developed mechanical trouble while en route from the Gulf of Oman. The president gave the order to abort the mission, but on their way back to base, one of the helicopters collided with a fuel plane, resulting in the deaths of 8 servicemen. The mission was a complete failure. Americans grew increasingly frustrated. And here's a picture of the crash there. The standoff with Iran caused many Americans to feel humiliated and bewildered. They wondered why the Iranians had taken such actions. They could not understand how a great superpower could be rendered helpless by a comparatively small and distant nation. In Iran, the effect was the opposite. Militant Islamists felt triumphant. They hailed Khomeini and the hostage takers as heroes. In their view, the Iranian revolutionaries had successfully used terrorism to challenge the Great Satan, as they labeled the United States. The hostage situation dragged on for 444 days. Not until President Carter was out of office, replaced by Ronald Reagan, were the hostages released at last. And that's where we'll end this reading. Let's go back to the lesson. And make sure that you check your lesson answer key to check your answers on the reading guide, and continue on. In the presidential election of 1976, the Democrats nominated a true outsider, Jimmy Carter. When this former Georgia governor and peanut farmer told his mother he was going to run for president, she asked, "President of what?" Although Carter failed to win a second term, he had success in foreign affairs. Today you'll read about these successes, including the Camp David Accords. So follow the directions in the student guide to continue today's lesson, which was the reading which we already completed. And then don't forget to do this activity, Stagflation, the Economic Crisis of the 1970s. I'll just show you what it looks like, but it's basically a series of readings that you'll go through, audio readings that is, and I'm not going to listen to them all for the recording, but you can see they're all like that, and you'll click through each of the buttons at the bottom to go through the whole section on the economic crisis of the 70s. Let's read the chapter 38 highlights and then the last thing you'll do today is the 5.12 quiz. By 1968, Americans were weary of the Vietnam War and a battered social order at home, and elected Republican Richard M. Nixon president on his promises of law and order and states' rights. Nixon proved to be a moderate on domestic issues, strengthening some of Johnson's Great Society programs, creating the Environmental Protection Agency, and using affirmative action to address problems of racial discrimination in employment. Nixon's attempt to end the war in Vietnam resulted in a tentative peace agreement in 1972, but the war continued. Nixon worked to ease Cold War tensions with Communist China. The United States and the Soviet Union pursued a policy of détente, efforts to ease tensions, establish better relations, and reduce the chances of nuclear war. Newspaper reporters, a congressional investigation, and federal prosecutors revealed abuses of power by Nixon and high-ranking White House officials in a scandal known as Watergate. The Watergate scandal led to Richard Nixon's resignation and shook Americans' faith in their government. Gerald Ford's administration was plagued by stagflation with rising prices and declining employment. The war in Vietnam ended in 1975 when North Vietnamese troops captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. President Jimmy Carter tried to establish an informal, accessible tone for his presidency. Carter's major achievements was brokering the peace talks between Egypt and Israel that resulted in the Camp David Accords. In 1979, Iranian revolutionaries broke into the American embassy in Tehran and took more than 60 Americans hostage, keeping them for over a year and weakening Carter's presidency. So don't forget to review lesson 510 and 511 and 512 before taking the 5.12 quiz, and good luck.